Good morning, BookTube. It is a beautiful Saturday morning. I am here to do a review of Theatre by Somerset Maugham. And you may have noticed that I've done a little something with my hair. I did overnight pillow curlers, and I can't decide whether it looks fantastic and like the 1940s or whether I look absurd, but certainly got some volume and some curl. I've never had hair this curly in my life because the traditional hot curling iron just doesn't seem to work on my hair. But that is not the point of this video. The point of this video is Theatre by Somerset Maugham. Now this is a copy from 1937, and I had known a little bit about this novel because I had read that biography of Somerset Maugham last month, and the author briefly mentioned this book, and he mentioned it in a way that made it seem like one of his, lesser known works, which it is, but also one of his lesser well done works. But I don't think I agree on that point. I think it was quite a good novel, and in fact it's quite different from what I was expecting based on that biography, because the biographer made it sound as though this was a novel about two people who are very, very attractive, and the advantage that gives them in life and the way they use people because they can. But I got a slightly different impression, if not a very different impression, as I was reading this, because our main character Julia, who is an actress, she has reached the age of 40. Our main character Julia she is only attractive to people because she is that famous actress, because she is putting on all that makeup and taking the stage, and because she has a certain charm. In fact, she is described as not all that beautiful at all. Her maid doesn't think she's all that beautiful. Looking in her own mirror, she realizes, although her body is good, although she's got the makeup on, when she goes out, in ordinary clothes without all the makeup, she is just an ordinary person who doesn't even cause any heads to turn. At one point, she does something rather absurd. She walks up and down, all made up in these fancy clothes, down this stretch of road, hoping that, as in the story she's heard about beautiful women who sometimes get followed in the street, she will be followed in the street. But all that happens is one man follows her, and she realizes that no, it's not to ask her to a cinema, you would assumedly make out in the back row, not to ask her to a cinema or to a hotel or back to his rooms. Rather, he has recognized her as the famous actress who is in all the plays, and he would like an autograph for his wife, for his girlfriend. And so she is rather disappointed, and she insults him in her own mind. We get this internal dialogue from her where she is going back and forth between calling the people in her life poor lamb, when she feels sympathy for them, and what an asshole. Not exactly in those words, but she gets quite upset with anyone who doesn't give her what she feels is her due, with anyone who doesn't play into the scenes that she is making for herself in her life. There are some very awkward moments in this novel for her, because she approaches everyone and every moment in her life as though it is a scene in one of her plays. And perhaps this is, an old tired idea, but I think it's very well done here, because you almost don't notice it at first. Subtly, near the beginning of the novel, we have her thinking things like, oh, what line should I use here? Or what play was that a line from? Comparing herself to Hamlet, comparing herself to characters in the plays that she's been in. And for her, this is fine. For her, life is art. Everything in life reflects art and is art, and there really is no boundary for her between her real life and the theater. And she sees no problem with this. She understands life as to be one constant series of scenes, and perhaps she thinks that everyone is acting as well because she doesn't know any other way to relate to life. And we get a little bit of her backstory. She was brought up as an actress almost from childhood. A family member of hers, an aunt I believe, was an actress herself, and so her aunt brought her up to reflect those acting styles. And by 13 she was acting and reciting those lines that her aunt knew better than her aunt herself. And going to acting school as a young woman was really only a stepping stone to the modern methods of acting. And almost immediately she was picked up by a director, and at this company where she was acting, she met Michael, who is her husband in this novel. And when she first met Michael, she was head over heels in love with him, far more than he was in love with her, which frustrated her. But with time, she reconciles that and comes to see him as the perfect husband, as someone that she will continue to flatter, as someone who can keep her good reputation as an actress. And they are seen as this perfect couple in society, in the arts scene, because they have been true to each other for years and years. She is 40, so it's been at least 20 years, maybe more. And it's a given that she is true to Michael and is not having affairs with anyone else, will not fall in love with anyone else. And she plays the part, at least publicly, at least to the people around her. But there are others in her life. We have Charles, who it has almost been a given that she has been having an affair with him for almost the last 15 or 20 years. And people believe that they've been having an affair for so long that it's almost acceptable. When they stay at people's houses together, they are put in adjoining rooms because the hostesses believe they are sleeping with each other. But of course, Julia says nothing of the kind has ever happened. And even though she has declared her love for Charles, and Charles has declared his love for him, nothing has ever happened between them. And they've talked about, running off to an island, running off to Italy, to an Italian villa, but nothing ever much comes of it so far at the start of this novel. And Julia really just sees it as another role to play. She plays the supposed lover of Charles, and she enjoys that role, and she enjoys his friendship. But there's an interesting question raised in this novel. Is Charles in love with her, or is he also just playing a role? But sort of the inciting incident at the start of this novel is an accountant who is doing the theater's books. And we open with a scene where Julia and her husband Michael are having a conversation, and they decide to invite the accountant to dinner. This young accountant by the name of Tom, who it actually takes several chapters for them to realize his name. Julia actually ups and has a rendezvous with him in his rooms, still not realizing what his name is. So that tells you what sort of a person Julia is. And yet we like her because she is doing what she thinks is best. She is doing what she thinks is right. She is passionate. And she comes on the scene as the neglected woman, the woman who has been neglected by her husband, the woman who perhaps has never really been loved. And then we have passionate Tom coming in very aggressive, and Julia taking a liking to him, and suddenly her acting is invigorated. She is acting better than ever every night because of her love for Tom. But of course, Tom is young and only a couple years older than her own son Roger, So that can't really last, at least we don't think it can last. And Julia has made up her mind never to tell Tom that she loves him, because she knows that she will, she'll be at his mercy, so to speak. And she does everything she can to get the upper hand. Tom is poor, Julia is extremely wealthy, and so she starts buying him things and proposing holidays and proposing she helped him rent a flat. And she keeps all this from her husband because, of course, it's too absurd that she could ever be in love with someone else, because her husband thinks she's completely loyal. And so we get all these complexities in this novel. Who is Julia really in love with? Who is Julia really? Do we ever see the real Julia? And is it okay that she views every moment in her life as part of a role she's playing? And then we also have Dolly. And Dolly is an older woman who helped Michael to start his theater company and helped Julia on in her career through finance. And she is sort of a character in the wings, but she is yet another complex layer to Julia, because Dolly is in love with Julia, and Julia strings her along a little bit and allows Dolly to kiss her in one scene we see, but behind Dolly's back, in her own mind, she refers to Dolly as that old cow. And so we see just what kind of gratitude Julia has for the people who have helped her in her career, and what kind of attitude she has towards her friends. If she's saying that about Dolly, what else is she saying about her husband? What else is she saying about Tom? What is she saying about her colleagues that she acts with? So she is really a horrible character that you fall in love with as you read this novel, because you really do feel as though you can have sympathy towards her. You can almost justify her behavior. And even if you can't justify it, you can like who she is as a person, because she is delightful to read about. But there is one scene that I wanted to read in regard to her acting. There are many I could read. Her husband Michael is incredibly vain. He is focused on being the most attractive man in London, and of course Julia is incredibly vain, and Tom is incredibly vain. But if we go to page 260 here, it's near the end of the novel when she's having these musings about acting. And it's quite a long passage, and I'm not sure how much I'm going to read. I'm just going to read until it feels right. And it really is, the cherry on top of this novel. It tells you what it is about in its entirety. It's about Julia and her inability to ever stop acting, which is a sad thing, but perhaps not so sad, because she is incredibly fulfilled in her life, or at least that's what she leads us to believe, until she wonders, what am I? Am I there if there's no one else in the room? So she's been having a conversation with her son. She gave him her delightful and disarming smile. "Darling, I think you're talking nonsense." "Of course you do. You don't know the difference between truth and make-believe. You never stop acting. It's second nature to you. You act when there's a party here. You act to the servants. You act to father. You act to me. To me, you act the part of the fond, indulgent, celebrated mother. You don't exist. You're only the innumerable parts you've played. I've often wondered if there was ever a you, or if you were never anything more than a vehicle for all these people that you pretended to be. When I've seen you go into an empty room, I've sometimes wanted to open the door suddenly, but I've been afraid to, in case I found nobody there." She looked up at him quickly. She shivered, for what he gave her an eerie sensation. She listened to him attentively with a certain anxiety, for he was so serious that she felt he was expressing something that had burdened him for years. She had never in his whole life heard him talk so much. "Do you think I'm a sham? Not quite, because sham is all you are. Sham is your truth, just as margarine is butter to people who don't know what butter is. She had a vague feeling of guilt, the queen in Hamlet. And let me wring your heart, for so I shall, if it be made of penetrable stuff. Her thoughts wander. I wonder if I'm too old to play Hamlet. Siddons and Sarah Bertrand played him. I've got better legs than any of the men I've seen in the part. I'll ask Charles what he thinks. Of course, there's that bloody blank verse. Stupid of him not to write it in prose. Of course, I might do it in French, as at the Français. God, what a stunt that would be. She saw herself in a black doublet with long silk hose. Alas, poor Yordic. But she bethought herself. You can hardly say that your father doesn't exist. Why, he's been playing himself for the last 20 years. Michael could play the king. Not in French, of course. But if we decided to have a shot at it in London... Poor father, I suppose he's good at his job, but he's not very intelligent, is he? He's so busy being the handsomest man in England. I don't think that's very nice of you to speak of your father like that. Have I told you anything you don't know? He asked coolly. Julia wanted to smile, but would not allow the look of somewhat pained dignity to leave her face. It's our weakness, not our strength, that endears us to those who love us, she replied. In what play did you say that? She repressed a gesture of annoyance. The words had come naturally to her lips. But as she had said them, she remembered that they were out of a play. Little brute. But she came in very positively. You're hard, she said plaintively. She was beginning to feel more and more like Hamlet's mother. Don't you love me? I might if I could find you, but where are you? If one stripped you of your exhibitionism, if one took your technique away from you, if one peeled you as one peels an onion, of skin after skin, of pretense and insincerity, of tags of old parts, and shreds of faked emotion, would one come upon a soul at last? He looked at her with his grave, sad eyes, and then he smiled a little. I like you all right. Do you believe I love you? In your way. Julia's face was suddenly discomposed. If you only knew what the agony I suffered when you were ill. I don't know what I should have done if you'd have died. You should have given a beautiful performance of a bereaved mother at the bier of her only child. Not nearly as good a performance as if I'd had the opportunity of rehearsing a few times, Julia answered tartly. You see, what you don't understand is that acting isn't nature, it's art, and art is something you create. Real grief is ugly. The business of the actor is to represent, if not only with truth, but with beauty. If I were really dying, as I've died in a half dozen plays, you'd think I'd care whether my gestures were graceful and my faltering words distinct enough to carry to the last row of the gallery. If it's a sham, it's no more a sham than a sonata of Beethoven's, and no more of a sham than the pianist who plays it. It's cruel to say that I'm not fond of you. I'm devoted to you. You've been the only thing in my life. No, you were fond of me when I was a kid, and you could have me photographed with you. It made a lovely picture, and it was fine publicity, but since then you haven't bothered much about me. I bored you rather than otherwise. You were always glad to see me, but you were thankful that I went my own way and didn't want to take up your time. I don't blame you. You hadn't got time in your life for anyone but yourself. Julia was beginning to grow a trifle impatient. He was getting too near the truth for her comfort. You forget that young things are rather boring. Crashing, I should think, he smiled. But then, why do you pretend that you can't bear to let me out of your sight? That's just acting too. You make me very unhappy. You make me feel as though I haven't done my duty to you. But you have. You've been a very good mother. You've done something for which I shall always be grateful to you. You've left me alone. I don't understand what you want. I told you, reality. But where are you going to find it? I don't know. Perhaps it doesn't exist. I'm young still. I'm ignorant. I thought perhaps that at Cambridge, meeting people and reading books, I might discover where to look for it. If they say it only exists in God, I'm done. Julia was disturbed. What he said had not really penetrated to her understanding. His words were lines, and the important thing was not what they meant, but whether they got over. But she was sensitive to the emotion she felt in him. Of course, he was only 18, and it would be silly to take him too seriously. She couldn't help thinking he got all that from somebody else, and that there was a good deal of poise in it. Did anyone have ideas of his own? And did anyone not poise just a wee bit? But of course it might be that, at the moment, he felt everything he said. It wouldn't be very nice of her to make light of it. Of course I see what you mean, she said. My greatest wish in the world is that you should be happy. I'll manage your father, and you can do as you like. You must seek your own salvation. I see that. But I think you ought to make sure that all these ideas of yours aren't just morbid. Perhaps you are too much alone in Vienna, and I dare say you read too much. Of course, your father and I belong to a different generation, and I don't suppose we can help you. Why don't you talk it over with someone more your own age? Tom, for instance. Tom, a poor little snob. His only ambition in life is to be a gentleman, and he hasn't the sense to see that the more he tries, the more hopeless it is. I thought you liked him so much. Why, at Taplow last summer you just lived in his pocket. I didn't dislike him. I made use of him. He could tell me a lot of things that I wanted to know, but I thought him an insignificant, silly little thing. Julia remembered how insanely jealous she had been of their friendship. It made her angry to think of all the agony she had wasted. You've dropped him, haven't you? He asked suddenly. She was startled. I suppose I have, more or less. I think it's very wise of you. He wasn't up to your mark. And so the scene goes on like this, and it's interesting because even as Robert is proclaiming himself not to be like Julia and not to be a snob like Tom, we've just seen him behave as a snob, and we've just seen him, at least from Julia's eyes, put on a scene, rehearse lines, say things that sounded very much like an act in a play. And so it's a complex and very interesting novel, and I have to say that I greatly enjoyed it. And the characters are just very vivid and very interesting to read about, and we get fiery scenes like that. So overall, a very good novel, and I'm very glad that I read it. And I will be continuing on, of course, with my journey with W. Somerset Maugham. So this was theater from 1937.